Thank you so much for caring enough about this subject to make time to come and listen to Dr. Cheever. My name is Bonnie Cook. I'm a professor in the English department here at Hudson Valley. I'd like to say before we formally start, there are surveys. Probably you got one when you came in. Please take a moment to fill them out. They'll be collected on the way out, or you can put them back on the table. But let us know what topics and subjects you are interested in hearing in the future. That would be really great. So welcome to our last Voices lecture for the fall. We'll have a whole new slate in the spring. Keep your eye out for our brochures. We would like to begin today with an acknowledgement that we are gathered on the sacred homelands of the Kanien'kehá:ka, or the Mohican people, who are the stewards of this land. Today, this community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation. We pay honor and respect to these people, to their ancestors past and present. It is my honor and pleasure today to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Holly Cheever. Dr. Cheever is a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard University, and at a time when Cornell's College of Veterinary Medicine, perhaps the finest veterinary school in the country, admitted few women at all, Dr. Cheever was ranked #1 in her class. Dr. Cheever is a veterinarian, an educator, a protector of animals, and a fierce pursuer of those who abuse animals. For over 40 years, she's worked on the local, state, and national level to fight animal abuse. She has educated law enforcement officials on the use of anti-cruelty laws and assisted them in the prosecution of animal abuse cases. She's spoken before Congress on the brutal treatment of circus and zoo animals and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's failure to inspect and to prosecute such abuse cases. She's spoken at numerous schools, from elementary through college, and to other veterinarians about how to advocate for animals and improve their lives. Dr. Cheever is in her 40th year of private veterinary practice with an extensive background in dairy cattle and horse husbandry, as well as companion animal medicine. She's a partner in the Village Animal Clinic in Voorheesville, New York, and for 30 years maintained a small animal sanctuary for farm animals rescued from abuse. Today, Dr. Cheever is going to speak about what we can do to help protect not only the health of animals, but also the imperiled health of our planet. It is a privilege to have such an accomplished and knowledgeable speaker at Hudson Valley Community College today. Please warmly welcome Dr. Holly Cheever.
I just like animals a lot. That's what it comes down to. I have sometimes a bit of a weak voice, so if you don't hear me well in the back, please let me know and I'll speak louder. Can you hear me okay, everyone? So I appreciate that Bonnie used the word stewardship, referring to the Native Americans who used to live here, because this is really what I want to talk about today, is what kind of stewards are we for the very fragile planet that we're living on and trying to share not very well with other species. So primum non nocere, I know there's nothing more sexy than a Latin phrase to make you all come racing out of your rooms in the morning to come off to class. But please excuse the Latin, because I've always appreciated this statement. And it was an oath that doctors, hundreds of years before now, would swear before they started off on their medical careers. And primum non nocere basically means, first, do no harm. Or as I paraphrase it at the bottom here, just don't make things worse. Try to make things improved. And so, are we good stewards? And I'll let you read all of that. I don't need to read it for you. But the way we handle animals can either be beneficial for them or can be very malignant for them. And I think everyone who comes to an lecture like this must be somewhat aware that climate change is really happening and that species are just tanking and going extinct at record rates. And at this point, many of the extinction processes are so far advanced and so steeply declining that it's just a matter of time before we won't see those animals anymore. And personally, as you can see in the bottom, I was so lucky. I grew up on the North Atlantic, near Cape Cod, family home going back 150 years or so. And in my 70 years from first opening my eyes there till now, a lot of things changed. There were species that went away. If I have not heard a bobolink, a bobwhite, which is a member of the partridge family and quail family, I haven't heard one of those for probably 50 years. I haven't heard a whippoorwill sing at night. They're one of the few birds that sing at night, and I used to just love to hear them through my open window. Haven't heard them for 50 years either. We don't have any more eels. We used to. We don't have any more eelgrass. We used to. And whereas I used to find horseshoe crabs daily on the beach, I don't anymore. And so that's not that long a time when you think about geologic time or evolutionary time. In 70 years, I've certainly seen a difference. And I've also noticed that the water is a lot deeper. We had this huge rock on the beach near our house that the water would come up to about 20 feet at the highest tide, the moon tides, and it was never closer than 20 feet. Now it's right up at the big red rock, as we called it in our childhood. So clearly, the habitat that I find most likely to be my home has been impacted. Now, I don't mean to insult your intelligence when having that first statement means extinction means they're gone. It's a permanent loss. There are no do-overs, and that I think is what's so frustrating when we see populations beginning to go down because of all kinds of pressures from our species primarily. And by the time we catch on to it, it's often too late to arrest the decline. The first guy that went was the dodo. And I know people talk about, I've used the phrase of, oh, you're as dumb as a dodo. Well, they weren't dumb birds, they just had never had predators before. And the humans, the Dutch sailors that came in the 15th and 16th centuries, 16th and 17th century, said, hey, easy meal, walks right up to you and asks to be killed, so they would kill it. And, you know, they were kind of cute. I mean, I'm sorry to be all like, you know, I know you're supposed to not be professionally talking about animals as cute, but they are. At any rate, I would have loved to have been able to see a dodo a few hundred years later if they had not been brutally eliminated primarily for food. So that was the first time that we saw an extinction. And apparently, and I don't know where in the scripture, there was a religious belief that you could not have extinctions. Like I said, God would keep on in his mercy creating more and more of something if you caused them to tank. Unfortunately, this is where we found out very quickly that in 3/4 of a year, the population was gone. One of the ones that I have a particular fondness for in the whole annals of extinction is a passenger pigeon named Martha. Martha was named after George Washington's wife, Martha Washington, and she was the last of her species. And what was unique about the species, as you can read, is that they were so numerous. They were numbered in the billions, billions with a B, not millions. And they would migrate east to west, west to east annually. And when they migrated, they went over your patch of the earth, there would be 2 days in a row where the sky was simply blackened. You couldn't see the sun. It was like having sort of like an eclipse. There were that many of them. But then, you know, the people who were trekking west and east would blow them out of the skies. People would have hunting contests, and then one of the other things that we did to the planet by moving ourselves around was to bring our household pets, our dogs and our cats. And when we released them to hang around with our new little log cabin or wherever we were moving ourselves to, they started adding into the elimination of species because the wild animals had not experienced them before. So we certainly had our impact, and that's a picture of not of Martha, of course, she died in 1914, but of a passenger pigeon. And what was sort of touching at this point is by that point, scientists, biologists had realized that extinction was very possible. So there actually was a hard core of scientific people standing around her cage weeping as she died because they just were so moved painfully by what our species has done. And in one of the articles I was reading about her death, someone was allegedly quoted as saying, just because I can kill 50,000 birds in a day doesn't mean I should. Okay, good, buddy. Glad you got that under your belt. But anyway, we now, I hope, begin to feel a little bit more stewardship responsibility in what we're doing and how we're impacting other animals on the planet. Another real sad thing is monarch butterflies. And monarch butterflies, they migrate from New England all the way down to Mexico. These little fragile things go all that distance. They are major pollinators. When they come and they go onto your flower, and their favorite is milkweed, They pick up the pollen on their wings as they're trying to get their meal from the plant. And the next plants they go over to, they are bringing that pollen and spreading the seed around to encourage those plants to grow. But with habitat destruction is the primary thing. People, if they move into an area which has wild milkweed, they don't cherish the wild milkweed. They cut it down and make it into a lawn, a suburban lawn that you have to spend all kinds of time and energy to mow all the time, rather than having something pretty. So cars, pesticides, herbicides, and all of those kind of things are taking down their numbers dramatically. And so because they are such extensive pollinators, that's going to have all this whole ripple effect of other animals that are then going to have trouble finding the food they need, and more populations will decline. And in my summers as a youth, I would find that we would have monarch butterflies all over the place. And now I might see 3 or 4 in a season, in the summer season. So, and that's obviously not enough to keep a population going. It's just so beautiful. Unfortunately, whenever we decide to off a species for whatever reason, we take away a lot of beauty, beauty and variety that we were blessed with and just could not maintain, unfortunately. Bird populations, as you can see there, they're a real canary in the wood, canary in the coal mine kind of a situation. We've lost so many, again, it's in the billions, not just the millions, that they get to where they can't find breeding pairs. They can't find their mates, and they don't have the places to go that they've been going for generations. And it's been such a long time since canary in the coal mine was created as a phrase, but a very standard phrase. Does everyone know what that refers to? When you were mining in England or wherever, and toxic, noxious gases would start to come up from the coal mine, they would put a canary in a little cage right at the entrance of the coal mine, and if the canary was fine and asking for breakfast and supper, everything was good. If you came up one day to give the canary supper and it was on its back, dead in its cage, then you knew that the noxious gases were beginning to come out and would poison humans, and so that was your warning to get your ass out of that cave right now before you died. So once again, birds are being sort of used as a warning system. If I have this kind of loss, including the birds that come to bird feeders, the ones that, for those of us who feed birds, have grown up with, and we suddenly aren't finding them anymore, that's a signal that something is just not good. So what are some of the things that create this loss, this incredible increased surge of extinction rates? And by the way, if you look at graphs, and I just don't have the technology to take graphs from a book and put it into these magic things called PowerPoints, population growth, so human population growth is growing very slowly, and it suddenly takes this huge upswing in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And as we see the graph of the human population growth numbers go swooping up, and an exact parallel graph is the number of animals going extinct annually or by the decade. So that's, the more humans, the less there is of other things. One of the most controversial things, of course, is global warming. We'll be talking about that more at the end, because global warming could be improved greatly if we play around with our diet a bit. And whenever you bring up diet to an audience, sometimes it gets people a little bit edgy and defensive. So this is not the aim of this presentation. But at any rate, the things I think that we can all agree with is that in some states they have these carnivore killing contests. In other words, it'll be a coyote contest. So you and your sons or whatever go out there and blow away as many coyotes as you can in the time of a week span or a weekend. And then you bring all your corpses up to the county house where they count and see who has the most corpses. Now, coyotes are apex predators. Apex predators meaning really the top cheese, a very significant factor in any population's dynamic and growth and numbers. So if you blow away a huge number of the apex predators in an area, you're going to vastly rearrange that ecosystem. There'll be different predators, different apex or leading predators. There'll be fewer possibly food, prey to go around. But in addition to being devastating to populations, it's also, of course, just extremely cruel. Alaska, they keep trying to pass, and they may have passed, I don't remember, a law that allows the hunter to go and kill denned bears with their cubs. You can go into the den and blow them away. Well, that's sporting. So obviously these things just drive me crazy. And when we think about animal species losses in general, think about how we catch tuna. And this is something that's been going on for 30 years. So if any of you older people in the audience have been animal activists for a while, you've probably been buying dolphin-free, dolphin-safe tuna, or at least that was a big thing about 20 or 30 years ago. But even with the supposedly improved netting systems that are not supposed to take up all the rest of the animals around that tuna flock or group, you're still picking up sharks and dolphins. And for the animals like a dolphin, who is an air-breathing animal, they don't, when they're trapped in these nets, they don't drown. Dolphins don't drown because being voluntary breathers, which is what any aquatic marine mammal is, they don't breathe automatically the way I'm breathing and the way you're breathing. We're involuntary breathers. So I'll keep breathing until I'm dead, even if I'm talking or cooking or painting or whatever. The breathing goes on automatically. That obviously would not be a good feature for a marine mammal who might suddenly do an involuntary breath under the water and drown. So my point being that when dolphins are caught in these nets before they are lifted out of the water, they hold their breath, and what they eventually die of is suffocation. They suffocate themselves to death. And you think of it from the animal's point of view, how frustrating, how terrifying, and we don't need to be using this kind of killing method. We don't need to be eating that much tuna that we have to do this much destruction to literally millions of other animals. I think sharks, their loss in these nets is also counted in the millions. That's annually. Then you also have the huge volumes of plastic waste that are going on. And I know this is hard for all of us. I'm a good girl with my water bottle. I carry metal straws in my car so that when I'm driving back and forth to Massachusetts and I stop for my forbidden chocolate milkshake, which don't tell my husband, I have my little metal straw so I can say to the seller, please keep your plastic, I'm fine. And don't tell my husband that I have a chocolate milkshake, please. Now, in developing countries, unfortunately, one of the worst things that we as stewards have done for the rest of our own species here as Americans is made a lot of cultures that would not otherwise be eating so high on the food chain, certainly not eating cattle by the truckload. They do. They adopt an American diet. When we started going first, when China opened many decades ago and we began to visit back and forth, doctors would find that the people in Shanghai who continued to eat the Chinese diet had very little incidence of diabetes and heart disease, whereas the Chinese that adopted wholeheartedly the Western American diet very rapidly gained heart disease, diabetes, and for the women, night sweats and bad menopausal signs, which don't even happen in Japan. They don't have a word for the night sweats and the menopause changes that happen in America. So we're not having a good influence on a lot of different aspects of the planet with whom we share all this space. So the top slide shows you a plastic island. Have you heard of these? There are a couple of them at least, and I think more than that in the Pacific. I don't think they found them in the Atlantic. Probably something about the Gulf Stream being over here may prevent that. But they actually are where plastic has just floated on the surface and become this mass that you can't drive a boat through that. I mean, you can eventually wend your way through with cutting and being careful. But that is almost as solid as like a land mass, although it floats. So that's all the plastic that we're spewing out there thoughtlessly. And the one that really breaks my heart is this poor turtle here. I've always had a fondness for turtles. And can you imagine what it would feel like growing with that thing cinched around your waist? Obviously, this guy is not going to reach an adult or a final long state of its life because it's just not going to be able to live much longer if it can't use its lungs. The way turtles are built, their lungs are on the top, right underneath the top carapace, and they take up the whole space. And when you've got your lungs, and therefore your heart in that same area all kind of cinched together, it's just not something that's going to be a viable organism. So that guy's time on this planet is short. And the bird on the left, you can't see really well, but there's plastic tubes, plastic rings, bits and pieces of just something from like a plastic bottle. And the thing is that's so sad for the animals is that a lot of times when they see the plastic floating on the ocean, they assume it's food. It sparkles. It might reflect a little bit like a food item might, like a jellyfish or something. And so they snarf it down thinking it's breakfast, and instead it's going to be something that will accumulate. And I didn't have time to find pictures of like the pilot whales that they've opened up, but they brought out hundreds of pounds of junk from the larger marine mammals who just don't recognize it as a non-food item yet, and there has not been enough time for evolution to make them recognize the difference. There's all kinds of things that we do to imbalance nature out there, in addition to just simply being too many of us taking up more land and destroying more habitat. One thing, and a lot of times, things that we do, whether they are good or bad things, end up having unintended consequences, and this first paragraph is a good example of that. So, when you're an ivory poacher, you want the most ivory per animal, right? You don't want to kill 17 animals if I can only kill 12 animals and get the same amount of ivory. So you're going for the matriarchs, the oldest ladies in the female elephant herds, and you go for the patriarchs, the oldest gentlemen in the male herd. For those of you who are not familiar with elephant lifestyles or life cycles, when the babies are born, Mama keeps the babies, boy and girl, until the boys get to be a certain age. And any of us who have children, male children, can probably say, yeah, I'm feeling this. And then it gets to a point where the males are getting just a little bit too rowdy. So the males go off, and they're equivalent of being like a early teenager. They go off and live in the bull herds, the male herds, with the old gentleman bulls. And the old gentleman bulls, for all these thousands and millions of years of evolution, have kept those boys in order. So along comes trophy poachers, poachers going for the trophy of the ivory. So they kill the biggest and oldest animals to get the most ivory. With the mothers being killed, what that does is it takes away the repository of knowledge in the animal that has been alive longer and can remember that if it's a really bad drought and I can't find water here and I can't find water here, I remember that 15 years ago there was water over here, and they can save, therefore, their family unit because they've got the wisdom and the memory. Well, they don't have that anymore if their wise matriarch has been taken away. And for the boys, it's just, as I was saying, the boys go off, but there's no more male leader who keeps them in check, and therefore they've now started attacking rhinoceros. By the way, the plural for rhinoceros is rhinoceros. I keep not believing that and keep trying to find it in a dictionary, but that is in fact accurate. So, and of course, let's face it, it's an awful lot like our own species in a sense, in that if you have a group of rowdy young guys and you don't have any parental supervision or setting down the rules, you're more likely to get guys that get into trouble. And I also don't know if you're aware in terms of the bonding that goes on in elephant herds, to the point that if a favorite mother elephant has died here or a favorite father elephant has died here, when the youngsters migrate past that location every year in their annual trekking, they'll actually go over to the skull and they'll pick it up and caress it and put it back down very respectfully. It's been seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So they remember their family members, and we have done a lot to disrupt them, and with unintended consequences. The rhinoceros does not want to get beaten up by the wild bull, youngster, testosterone-driven elephants. And then the other thing that drives most of us crazy is the fact that you've got the people who get a python or get some kind of animal that they think is going to make them seem really cool. And then they realize, yeah, except that it tried to eat my newborn. Maybe we should think about this again. And so they do, and they dump it in the Everglades, or they go dump it in some kind of southern climate where they figure it's not my responsibility, I'm sure it'll have a lovely life, and I don't have to worry about having to deal with a dangerous carnivore. So in the Everglades, which has already got a very threatened ecosystem because of human interaction and exploitation, since 2002, over 2,000 abandoned pythons have been removed. And when you see pictures of the pythons in the articles about this kind of thing, they're not pythons like this. They are pythons that are like 12 feet long, with 4 people carrying them and huge bodies. It's not what you want in the Everglades, and it's not going to help the, as you say, native bobcats, rabbits, and possums that live there and have been there since, many, many centuries before they changed the predator that would take them away. The other thing that just drives me out of my gourd is the belief in animal materials as medicinal. I'm very respectful of different cultures, and frankly, sometimes I think Western medicine is no more than, dabbling around and coming up with bizarre conclusions. But there are some things that I know are not going to heal an illness. So pangolins, which look kind of like aardvarks, they have scales, and their scales are believed to help make your blood healthy. Moon bears, they get caught and kept in tiny cages while someone puts a catheter into their gallbladder and pulls away the bile, and that is packaged and used as a medicinal healer of various bad things. Tigers, they take the bones. Tigers, many of the tiger species are already endangered, and yet they'll still go out and kill them and take the bone, grind it up, and use it for, again, some malady which just does not react to swallowing tiger bones, positive or negative. And also for the rhinoceros, like the elephant, it's the horns that they sell. Now, shark fin soup. Have anyone ever come across shark fin soup? It's an Asian delicacy that has sort of been renewed as a delicacy. It kind of went out of favor for, I guess, a number of decades. But now it's suddenly considered hot stuff again. And shark fin soup means that you go out there, you net the shark, or you catch the shark on a line, haul it on board, cut off its dorsal fin, throw it back in the ocean. It plummets like a stone down to the bottom. It can't swim properly without its dorsal fin. And if it's been on the boat for a while you're hacking off that fin, it's become compromised in its respiratory system also. So they kill off sharks by the millions, literally the millions, every year, part of which goes into shark fin soup. And it's, a dorsal fin on a big shark might be this long and this high, on a smaller, more like this and like this. But for the sake of just having that little ingredient added to your soup, they will slaughter off 1 million animals. And sharks are also the apex predators of their species, meaning that if you take away the apex predator, the top cheese in a region, then you'll get other types of lower predator abilities becoming more numerous, and all kinds of species interactions begin to change and deteriorate because you've taken away the top of the mound that kind of kept the whole pyramid in order. So it does eventually cause the collapse of an ecosystem. Now, I don't know where we are in New York State's legislature. We occasionally have lobbying for legislation banning shark fin soup, and there are some cities that have banned it. There's never been a statewide ban, and certainly not a national ban. I lobby on some issues, but I don't remember what's happened with shark fin soup. But we have certainly tried to make it illegal to have that in New York State. Let's see here. So the thing with climate change is everyone in here does understand that there is climate change, right? Even if there's not necessarily a belief in how it got there. So, I mean, I've seen the differences because I live on the Atlantic Ocean. The hurricanes that pound us in the last decade are a lot worse than the hurricanes that pounded our shores back when I was, say, 0 to 10. And droughts are much more dramatic, which is why you have the California fires. Now, speaking of unintended consequences, no one in making city planning and habitat safety ever thought of the fact that California may have drought conditions to the point that you can't control the fires, and the fires get closer to the cities, and the cities' electrical boxes become endangered by the fire and cause these cataclysmic, huge fires, to the point that it just took that whole city. Was it a couple of years ago called Paradise, and the whole city was just razed to the ground. And I think 48 people died trying to get out and not getting out in time. So count on more of that. And tornadoes are worse, and everything is going to be more of a struggle, which means that there may be less food to go around. And certainly if there's less land, if you take a look at the globe, one of those old-fashioned little globes that have the whole Earth and all of its countries on it, maybe take like a little pencil in your mind and sort of draw a line from where the shore and the ocean meet currently to advancing in to eat up some of the land, and you'll see that there's going to be an awful lot of people displaced. And by the time it starts to get very tense and people get more and more territorial and panicked by immigrants, we won't go into politics currently in the United States right now because that could get everyone a little bit too distressed. But at any rate, there will not be a welcoming, unfortunately, of people who have to migrate, who are forced to migrate because their homes are simply underwater. So global warming and the water rise is going to, I'm afraid, bring on some very desperate and very tragic results in how humans get along or don't. In addition to just losing populations, of course, it's taking away habitats. So the birds that I don't have around my home anymore in Cape Cod, well, it's going to be joined by many others that will not be able to survive. Now, in terms of global warming, there are three that are particularly important, but the two most important are methane and carbon dioxide. Now, did most of you get that little green handout when you came in the door? It has facts from a book called, or a DVD called Cowspiracy. And so I just wanted you to have those in your hands so that you can sort of see some of the differences between the methane levels around the Earth and the diets that we all eat. They are actually very, very linked. This is a scene in North Carolina. This was September, last September 2018, when North Carolina had some horrendous flooding, again, much worse than it used to be, but now whenever there's a severe cataclysmic flood, it does this. On the left-hand side, those are pig barns where they raise hogs. On the right-hand side, that is some of the millions of laying birds, chickens that drowned in their own homes from the last flood, bad flood, which is Hurricane Florence. My daughter, who always makes sure that I'm not being too out there, would not let me put the pictures of the thousands of dead, drowned pigs floating, which is frankly where I would have gone with this slide. But anyway, so trust me, there are, out of sight, thousands of bodies of drowned pigs. So think of it from the animal's point of view. They're very sensitive to weather. They're very sensitive to the drop of barometric pressure, even just when there's a slight storm coming through, which is why your dog who's afraid of thunder starts to whine hours before you may even be aware that a thunderstorm is coming, because they feel the barometric pressure drop, which we don't have the sensitivity to feel. So the animals feel the barometric pressure drop. They're in a shitty situation anyway because they're factory farmed animals. So in addition to being uncomfortable, they get to be terrified until they drown. The other sequela to having this kind of thing on the left-hand side is that waste, before there was too much of it because of the floodwaters, that waste used to sit in nice little contained systems that then could be dispersed, spread in non-polluting places, used as plant food kind of things. I mean, the waste would be contained. But when you've got this much rain and this much flooding, the slurry stores, the lagoons as they're called, where they save all the pig waste or chicken waste or cattle waste, gets overwhelmed. That's spread now all over the neighborhood. That waste is going into people's backyards all over town. The stench remains for weeks before they can finally get the flooded water amounts under control. And water safety, safety of your drinking water supply is very challenged. And same thing for the birds. They know when things are getting desperate. And of course, every flock or herd animal, when they get desperate, their desperation communicates to the whole rest of the group. So in addition to sucking from an environmental point of view, from a cruelty point of view, this is horrendous. So you've got on that green sheet some of the facts about methane. It's the number 2 biggest driver of global warming, carbon dioxide being worse. And it turns out that cattle emit huge volumes of methane. Cattle are ruminants, and when they eructate, which means belching, they bring out methane. When they are flatulent, you all know what that means, they bring out methane. And so when the environmentalists talk about trying to drive less, use fewer fossil fuels, because that's going into the greenhouse gases, they say, okay, so we're going to drive less, I'll ride my bike more, I'll get an electric car, but they don't think about their diet. And it turns out that the amount of methane going into the atmosphere, it's only the whole fossil fuel industry, whether it's trucks or planes or boats or whatever, that is responsible for 13% of the methane layer around the planet. Whereas beef culture, simply raising beef, is responsible for 18%. So it is higher than fossil fuels. So many of the articles you read on this kind of problem will talk about, ride your bicycle to work, God bless you, that's wonderful, but if you're still eating, cows twice a day, hamburger for lunch and a steak or something, whatever, you're not gaining on the problem. You need to really rethink the diet. And I know that that kind of can get sort of people a little bit edgy, so I did not do a long beat you over the head about being vegan, because that's everyone's own choice. But certainly anything one can do to eliminate some of the beef products, beef in particular. Chickens certainly contribute to pollution. Sheep and goats may contribute to pollution, but nothing at the level that you find with cattle. Let's see. The other thing is, we are now 7.2 billion people. And I would be more firm on this if I were not myself the mother of 4 children, because I really like babies. So my responsible brain would have kept it to 0 to 2. My emotions kept it to 4. So, but I raised them as vegetarians, so they're having maybe less of a footprint than some of the other people around. Do I sound really defensive yet? At any rate, one thing that's hard to do for 7.2 billion people is to find adequate food. And they project, I think, by the 2040s, 2045 is when we're going to get to 9 billion. There is actually enough food to feed people. We do actually have enough arable, croppable land on the planet to feed that number, but not at the current diet rate. If you're going to have to switch to being much more vegetarian and vegan, of course, it would be wonderful. By the way, for those of you who are either vegetarian or vegan or thinking of doing so and just can't quite give up everything, in the spirit of true confession, I will confess that although I've been vegetarian for 50 years, I'm not quite vegan. There's some cheese that just really calls to me. But what I do, which is maybe a slight less guilty-inducing action, is we use goat cheese. First of all, goats are not suffering through the milking parlors and the intensive agriculture systems that pertain to dairy cows, and they don't exude anything like that amount of methane. So if you are willing to try to give up some meat and dairy but just can't give up everything, maybe goat cheese might give you a little bit of something to tide you over while you're fighting with your conscience. The thing about the Amazon, this has been going on ever since I was in college, so it's not a surprise, but it's known as the lungs of the planet because it's got such a huge tree mass. And the trees take in our carbon dioxide and they create oxygen, the opposite of what happens on land when we're just regular photosynthesis is happening. And it is being decimated 1 acre per second, which is just so fast, it's more than my brain can really wrap around. And 100 species of animals, which includes birds, mammals, reptiles, and insects. And I don't remember whether this study included plants as well, but at least 100 species of various animals, I guess. This was about animals only. It lost daily due to this destruction. And again, so it's not even that they're cutting down trees to build new houses or create new businesses. They're cutting down trees simply to have more grain raising space and cattle grazing space. It's all for cattle culture. So, what can we do? We'll go through this, and then we should have about, I don't have a watch, we have about 10 more minutes after this before, do you need to blast off at 10:50?
20 up, Holly.
20 up. So we'll discuss this a little bit, and then definitely open this up for questions and answers or thoughts or sharing or whatever. But there are all kinds of things you can do, and one thing is, let's just talk about your home. I don't know what it is that people find so fascinating about a monoculture of green grass that you have to use a fossil fuel to cut several times a summer. But instead of taking down your lovely local native bushes and flowers and stuff, you might try to make a creative landscaping where you're actually putting in native species to our area that attract birds. Because by going in and making suburbs, we've taken away all of those food sources. And so bird feeding is great, but also you might talk to a local ecologist/botanist and find out what kind of foods or berry-producing bushes should I plant that will look attractive for me, for my sense of aesthetics, but will also be able to give some kind of feeding and nurturing to the bird species that I'm trying to save from tanking altogether. Obviously, avoid pesticide and herbicide use because that stuff stinks in the environment for a long, long time. And I guess we sort of created monsters in the 3 of my 4 children who are female. If I go and buy something when they're coming to visit that isn't organic, I really get yelled at. So we try our best to be as conscientious as we can and try to support the toxic things as little as possible. I talked a little bit about plastic reduction already. You know, I really like the plastic bags that you get at the big shopping stores. I've got probably 12 or 15 of them, and some of them are like animal rights messages on the front, and some of them are just pretty, the sun's coming up, or whatever. But they're big and they're strong, and if I take 5 or 6 into the store with me, I don't need to use their plastic bags. So anything that you can do to minimize throwing stuff away, you know, please do it. And you saw the picture that breaks my heart of the turtle. It looks like he's got a girdle on because that plastic ring on the 6-pack holder didn't get cut. We were told to do this in college. Is take your if you've got your 6-pack with the 6 ring circles to hold the beer cans, cut those. If you're going to throw them out, cut them so that they don't end up being something that is like a tight noose around an animal who stuck his head through it. Reconsider travel plans. Now, what is the name of that wonderful Swedish activist who's about 16? Greta Thunberg. Thunberg. Well, do you know how Greta, she's been over on this side of the Atlantic doing all kinds of speaking. Do you know how she's going to go back to the European continent without increasing fossil fuel use? She's so cool, I can't stand it. She's hitchhiked. She's hitchhiking with a sailboat that is going with a young couple of an 11-month-old baby, and they're going to be going over to Europe with their boat, and it does not use any engines, it's all air. And so that's how Greta is getting home, is hitchhiking by sailboat. I'm thinking, damn, why didn't I think of that? Anyway, in my next life, I want to be her. I know she irritates a lot of people, but I admire her courage, and I feel her bitterness when she says, basically, how the hell could you do that to our planet so that I can't ever see a such and such or a such and such? And I admire her courage. So eating lower in the food chain, that's sort of what we're talking about, and that is, I think, something that, even for your own health, is something to think wisely of. Americans really do consume way too much cholesterol and calories. And it doesn't have to be all at once, it doesn't have to be brutal, but you can just cut out certain things and substitute certain things over time. And usually most people have less diabetes and less problems and less heart disease, certainly, not to mention less obesity if they do change to a vegetarian or vegan diet. Like I said, I've been almost vegan for 50 years. It really didn't cramp my style. And when I was a dairy veterinarian, the worst thing for me was to have a cow having a trouble with her birthing. And I finally pull out this bull calf who weighs about as much as I do. But because it's a bull calf, it's going to go off to a veal crate. And that's one thing that drove me out of dairy practice, was there was just too much cruelty in the standard husbandry methods that pertain to cattle milk and milk production. So I highly, highly recommend this DVD, Cowspiracy, that's down at the bottom. You can go into YouTube and get little snippets of it. Then you can also go on YouTube and find people who say, I think Cowspiracy sucks, and they give their impassioned reason why they don't agree with the data or whatever. But it certainly is pointing out a trend, and one of the trends is that all of these groups that are supposed to be saving the environment, like Greenpeace or Sierra Club, the groups that I thought were heroes in my childhood, they won't fight the cattle ranchers. So whereas we're putting out all of this methane from our way of raising food, as soon as, in Cowspiracy, you see, as soon as they talk to the head of Greenpeace or the head of Sierra Club and say, so why are you giving free rein and free passes to all these people who really are creating the worst pollution, the worst land use? Why aren't you doing anything to them? And they'll go, oh, God, look at the time, gotta go. And they just simply won't deal with it. So they are not getting my donations until they wise up a bit. Hey. The other thing is, I put in the two in the middle there, Pew Commission. Do you know what the Pew Commission is? It's basically like a think tank for all kinds of different subjects. So I know when I was in vet school, there was a Pew Commission looking into veterinary education across the board, and its pluses, its minuses, its goodness, its deficits. This one was done in 2008, and it has to do with basically industrial farm animal production, how we now have such intensive confinement that the meat that you eat has been raised miserably. And if you eat grass-fed cows, well, that's nice for the cow, I'll give it that much, but there's nowhere near enough land to raise, to be able to feed a large population with grass-fed anything, milk or dairy, milk or meat, I mean. So anyway, so the Pew Commission is a very reputable group, and the United Nations is the third one down, Steinfeld Handling Livestock's Long Shadow. That's where the original statistic of cows being much more of an impact on the methane level than all the fossil fuel use combined. And these are not radical groups, obviously, so I'm basically putting them over to see that there are some very heavy-duty, honest, intellectual, scientific studies that have shown that, in fact, it is the diet that is causing the greatest problem for global warming. So we have 5 more minutes, and I did want to have time open for people to ask questions if they have any. Any questions, any thoughts? Yes?
So what are your thoughts about companies like Burger King now peddling their plant-based burgers?
Well, the weird thing is that it's not targeting vegetarians. They're trying to go to the meat market, the meat population, obviously. So, however, Dean and I, my spouse and I, whenever we're on the road and we see a Burger King, damn, we zip right in there and we eat one of those burgers, because I want them to think, oh, there's a market out there. There's a population who want these. So if any of you like to go to Burger King, please consider eating their Whopper, whatever they call it, that's veggie.
Holly, can you repeat the questions?
Oh,
Repeat the questions so people can hear.
okay. The past questions or going forward? Okay. At any rate, so it's also a fairly tasty burger. I haven't eaten beef for 50 years, so what do I know? But we do enjoy them, and so we are supporting them. And Dunkin' Donuts has even come out now with some kind of plant-based something, so I got to go find a Dunkin' Donuts and get a chocolate donut, and then I'll also get the meat alternative. Question?
Yeah, more of a comment. So it really astounds me that the environmental organizations aren't more vocal about cattle ranching and the impact. That's more of a comment, really, because it really is the heart of the global warming. I saw Cowspiracy and it was shocking.
Well, and again, look at the people who agree with Cowspiracy.
Yeah.
These are not left-wing, hippie, crazy, brain-addled drug takers. These are people who are scientists. She's just saying how she's wondering why the industry or USDA or whatever is not doing something more to control cattle dissemination.
And the other point was just that, I don't know if you saw in the news recently that wild horses are being rounded up and
That's been going on for
sent to
years.
slaughter to make more room for cattle ranching. So it's a vicious cycle that this cattle issue.
Did you all hear that? Out in the Western Range, where they've been rounding up and keeping Mustangs going for decades, the cattle ranchers, by the way, to be really pissed off, the cattle ranchers rent our American land, free land out west. They only have to pay sort of the equivalent of like $1 per acre, sort of a rental fee, which is nonsense, in order to graze their cattle. And they want the horses off because the horses compete with the cattle for grazing. And yes, they do get sent to slaughter. And unfortunately, slaughter for horses is not benign at all. I mean, slaughter for any animal is terrifying because they know they're going to die. They smell the blood, they smell the fear pheromones, they hear the crashing bodies. And the reason that they can do it to cattle and swine, where they do this pneumatic bolt driven into the front of the skull to knock them out, and then they hoist them up, and then they exsanguinate them. Horses, it doesn't work that way. Horses are a head-shy species, so a cow and a hog, when they're getting into a fight, they're going to put their head down ready to charge. But horses are head-shy, as we call it in the horse world, and they toss their heads back. Whenever you get near them, then they're strange to them. They are flailing all over, so you can't get them on one shot. And so horses sometimes are shot 5 or 6 or 7 times before they finally are slaughtered. So, yeah, I mean, this is where you write your congressperson, and the Humane Society of the United States has a very good lobbying wing in Washington. So they're good people to kind of hook up with, and they have a legislative arm that you can contribute to or support. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
What about fish?
What about fish? I didn't include them in the slides because I knew I'd run out of time, but fish are faring even worse than land mammals, actually. Again, because you have these huge indiscriminate nets. And so they talk about fish take out of the ocean every year as being in the trillions, as opposed to being in the millions or billions for other kinds of fish. But that if you count fish from the smallest little minnows up to the huge big, not the marine mammals, but the hugest sharks or whatever, yes, they are. There's one dreary prognostication that we could be a fish-free ocean in 40 years. There just won't be anything left.
Did you say 40?
40 years. That's one person's assessment. So the point of this whole point of all of this is that we need to learn to live lightly. sort of like a 21st century equivalent of primum non nocere, in addition to just don't F up, for Christ's sake, excuse me, would be things like take only photographs, leave only footprints, or be responsible with how you use resources. We are in such a downward slide that if we don't wake up very soon, we're going to really lose so many species that I really am going to miss, and just change the world, which really is not ours to change. So for those of you out there who are interested in any kind of animal or nature or whatever, I think the most important thing you can do really is to think about your diet. And even if it's a matter of going to eating meat 2 to 3 times a week rather than 2 to 3 times a day, that's huge. And again, it's cattle that cause the most destruction. So I guess at this point, if there are no further questions. Oh, further question.
I have a question. Dr. Cheever, I was at the Green Sustainability Fair this past weekend, and there was a woman from the Woodstock Animal Sanctuary. And I was too far away to see, but she talked about the percentage of land that humans use versus what's left for animals. Do you know those stats?
I think Cowspiracy has them, and if you look at the green sheet, I know I did put down a couple of places about land use, but I can try to look that up. If you want to email me, I can look that up for you. Any other thoughts or questions? Well, thank you very much for your interest. I appreciate it.